This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, MICHAEL COVEL. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. My guest today is Brennan Dunn. Brennan has been an absolute godsend for me. Full disclaimer, I hired Brennan last year. He has assisted me on helping to allow my online process, quite simply, to work better. Brennan has an intimate understanding of how a particular website, the words on that website, your email, and how it all comes together for business owners. He knows how the system works. It's literally a trend-following trading system for business using email, using a website. Now, he's not the inventor of this. Other people will have great insights on our conversation today, but I don't care about that. I know Brennan, I like him, and I love where he brings this topic. Look, if you are not executing on the ideas that Brennan Dunn is talking about in this conversation, I don't care what your business is, you're behind. You're way behind. You're not even on the same damn field anymore. If he is in inning 9, that's Brennan, if he's in inning 9 about to win the game, and you're not doing any of this, you're in inning 1. Maybe they're not even letting you on the field. Look, I'm not being cocky. I've made a lot of mistakes, but I keep plugging away. I keep trying to find smart people to educate me, to show me the way. Brennan Dunn is one of those people. I hope you enjoy this conversation, and I hope you learn something. Because if you do, it's going to make you a little money. So Brennan, in advance of this call, I'm thinking to myself, I'm going back in time, taking myself to the late 1990s, thinking about my own personal experiences with websites. And I'm thinking about the modification of websites. And I'm thinking about sending out emails to alert people when I was making modifications. And I didn't have any particular training, and I didn't have any way to measure what I was doing. But instinctively, even into the late 1990s, with me in a folder of 500 pages of individual HTML making up a particular website of mine at the time, I was constantly making changes to the site, not personalized in a way for each individual user, but I realized that the engagement would go up the more changes I was making. And then on the flip side, every time I was making a change, I realized that email was such the tool in the sense that it just psychologically causes people to respond, to look at something versus just assuming that people are always wandering around your site. No, you've got to prompt them. That's the setup for where you are today in 2018. You've taken my little rudimentary experiences, which are important, but you've taken this to a whole nother level. But what I want to do before we even get into the tech and the lessons that you've learned, I want you to lay the foundation for the use of email, the notion of personalization, and the psychology behind it. Because we as human beings, we are pretty predictable in some ways, aren't we?
I guess you could say I have a very pessimistic approach to how virtually nothing ever changes ever, specifically around persuasion and getting people to do what you want to get them to do and so on. We could geek out probably for a while about a lot of different things, including my background I studied the classics in school, so I read a lot of dead Roman and Greek guys. But that actually, I think, it has led directly to what I'm doing today, which is building really a platform that enables people to change the way you communicate at scale in real time, which is, I guess, a good way to set things up.
Let me keep you in that early stage of you. Let me keep you at that stage of, you mentioned studying the classics. Let's talk about some of those lessons learned that you have pulled forward to today that are timeless. I mean, let's just talk about people for a while. We don't have to even get to the tech of it, because you write really interesting copy. You clearly know how to persuade.
I think most of my sales training came from Plato. The reason I say that is if you've ever read a Platonic dialogue, the most famous being the Republic, and then there's the Symposium and all the other smaller dialogues he's written, they're all conversational. They're all, you think of Greek philosophy or Platonic philosophy, I guess, as being, you're going to read it and it's just going to be this long, dense thing, but it's really just a conversation of some guys chatting on the streets of Athens. And what's interesting about what Socrates does is when he confronts somebody, when he confronts an Athenian, he has an agenda. He has some truth he wants them to realize. But he doesn't go out and do what all of us see every day on Facebook, which is broadcast this thought or this idea or this perspective that he has to everyone and basically force it down people's throats. Instead, what he does is he meets somebody where they are currently. So what level of awareness do they have? What beliefs do they have? And so on. And then he uses what is now termed Socratic questioning to peel away the layers of the onion to get somebody to basically admit what he wants them to believe after going through this series of rhetorical exercises, if you will. Studying that, to me at least, has been, everything I've done career-wise since then, when it comes to whether it's selling consulting or selling products or getting to speak at conferences or whatever, a lot of that I learned through reading the dialogues of Plato have come directly from that.
Well, let me phrase it back to you another way. So let's say you, Brennan, you have a higher truth. You've either put in a significant amount of time, energy, effort, and you know something that most people don't know. And that something that you know is worth money. And so you might just think, well, my gosh, I've got this thing. They should just give me money because I know it and I figured it out. But what you're really saying is that even though you've got this thing that you ultimately believe in your heart of hearts that they need, you still have to bring it down to where they are to ultimately get them to where that true belief that you figured out is.
Correct. And the way I look at it in the world of business is it's an exercise of preparing somebody to become a customer. That's something that I think a lot of us don't really think about all that much. And that's something that when you and I worked on your funnel, that was the big thing that I wanted to focus on was you can't just put a product in front of somebody and expect that everyone put in front of that product or service, first off, knows that they need this product. And second is prepared to become a customer of that product. The thing that I've come to realize over the years has been the single best strategy I've ever employed when it comes to selling anything has been putting somebody on a very prescribed, very focused, very, dare I say, personal sequence that leads them to not only be prepared to buy, they know the language, they know the need, they know the problem they have and so on, but also really gets them to be a good customer, get them to be ready to be a great success story or great testimonial or great case study for the product that I'm trying to sell them.
So, the way back in the day that I would have achieved what you are talking about for today, I would have just kept receiving feedback from people and then increasing the size of my site, taking their feedback and then creating new content, et cetera, et cetera. And I would just kind of leave it out there as this amorphous blob with not necessarily any direction. And people would sift through it. And I guess if my content was really good, and I like to think it was and has been and continues to be, they would buy something. That mindset, though, which I think the vast majority of people still participating online have, is not exactly optimal for today, is it?
It works. It's more of it's an older way of thinking. If you think about, when I go to create a brochure for a product I might offer, say back before the internet was a thing and you're selling through literature, whether it be sales letters that you mail out to people or a brochure or something like that, you don't really have the ability to make it dynamic, if you will, right? So you're basically needing to put together a static resource that gets distributed. Now, the thing you mentioned earlier, which is true, is that the internet is very nice in that you can actually change that brochure after it's been published, after it's been printed, which makes it much better for what you were talking about, which is this kind of almost, putting your ear to the ground, seeing what's working, talking with people, learning about, where they're getting confused, where they're getting, or what they're doubting, what kind of objections they might have, and so on, and then iterating over time, with the idea being trying to come up with a very common denominator set of language and copy that has broad appeal to the kind of people you're trying to sell to. The difference, though, the thing that I'm trying to make more widely accessible, because it's not something that myself or the business that I started has created or discovered in any way. It's really the oldest trick in the book, which is if you want to convince somebody to do anything on an individual level, you take into account who is this person, how are they behaving, and what relationship do I already have with them, and you let that influence the way you convince them to do something. So if you want, if our distant ancestor wanted to get somebody to join his hunting party, then he's going to persuade the other person just by trying to find a way to connect with them and find a way to show them what's in it for them and so on. And the distinction is online, when we're trying to sell a product or a service, not everyone needs it for the same reason. It's a good copywriting exercise to think, how can I distill down all these different needs and desires and dreams that these people have into a core single marketable asset, like a website. But what we're at the point now where we can still do much of what's worked for millennia, which is basically this individual, highly personalized, very kind of reactive cause and effect method of persuading somebody to do something, but doing that at scale, doing that through automation, doing it through in a way that doesn't involve an individual, say, salesperson trying to find a way to connect to the person they're trying to sell to.
Let me put a pin on you for right there for a moment, because I want to stop you at that point, because that's going to shoot us off into a lengthy part of this conversation. I want to keep you at something very basic and rudimentary, and I think you've probably got some good experience here to share, which is the copy itself. You mentioned Plato, you mentioned Socrates, you've mentioned Persuasion now several times. Let's talk about your copy. Let's talk about your ability to write. I'm guessing by the way you talk and the way you think, when I see a lot of that copy out there, you're the guy that's cranking that out. I don't think there's an army of virtual assistants out there that have duplicated your way of thinking. I mean, I kind of have talked to you enough to know when I can see your writing. Talk to me about copy and your ability to get to the point where you produce good copy. What's been this process? How long has it taken you? What resources have influenced you?
So at a minimum, I think the thing that's helped me most has been the fact that I read. That's kind of, I think, a prerequisite for any of this, because you're probably like me. You can tell when somebody, let's say they're a blogger or maybe even an author, you can tell when they don't have a history of reading. I think it tends to be pretty obvious. So I'd say that from how do you construct sentences, grammar, flow, all that sort of stuff. But when it comes to actual conversion copywriting, the idea of being, now we're one of the evil sophists, right? That Socrates hated so much. These people who would use rhetoric in a way that was very self-serving. In this case, what we're doing is we're trying to find a way to say, I have a business offering. I have a thing that I want to put in your hands, and now it's my job to get you to buy that. Influences for me have been many, but the two that I'm going to point out are Amy Hoy and Jonah Weeb. So Amy Hoy, I first came across her, I want to say in 2009 or 10. And in 2011, I took a course of hers on building products. So at the time, I had a decent sized consulting company we had 11 employees. I was kind of sick of the whole, we had about 100,000 a month in overhead, and we had a few clients at any given time. But if one of them either ran out of funding or walked away or something like that, that was pretty upsetting. And I saw people like Amy who had thousands of people paying her $20 a month. I looked at that with envy. So I liked that model better, where you have high volume, low amounts versus low volume, high amounts. So I took this course that she offered called 30 by 500. It was really a course on how to create a business to business product that you can sell at scale. And ideally, it's either software or packaged information. Her whole thing, her premise was businesses are easy to sell to because all you need to do is tell them how to make more money or how to spend less money, aka become more profitable. They'll typically buy it. If you can give them a convincing reason for how you can help them do that, then that's a good thing, and they'll buy that. Her whole thing was a very pragmatic, not very risky approach to building products that will probably sell. So it's not about building the next Airbnb. Instead, it's saying, how can we find a business problem that a lot of businesses have that they're willing to spend money on and solve it? So that's what kind of led me down. And her whole copywriting philosophy is something called pain, dream, fix, which again, I don't think is anything new, but it's basically, start with the pain, show somebody that you understand where they are right now, present the dream, which is where they want to be conceptually, not the thing you're trying to sell them, but where do they want to be? How do they want either their life or their business or whatever else to be different, say a year from now? And then the fix, which is the offer. So that's a very, easy way of just saying, look, if I want to convince you to buy, say, this course that I've created, the first thing I need to do is show somebody that I get who you are and where you are right now and why that's a bad place. With trend following, for instance, it's about setting the stage and saying, look, you've been let down by the talking heads and by the Jim Cramers of the world and everyone else. And here's why. And here's what I get about that. And what you want is this. You don't care about the product. The thing I'm trying to give you is just the bridge. It's just the way to connecting where they are now to where they want to be. No one actually cares. And that's the thing that I think a lot of us, myself included, really struggle with, is that nobody gives a damn about your product. They just want the results. And a lot of us, I think, focus so much on the features and here's what's inside, that we don't talk as much about here's what's inside. Here's how what's inside will enable you to get from here to there. So regardless of what you're selling, I think that's a big thing. So that's one influence. The other is Joanna Weeb, who is she runs a company called Copy Hackers. And her whole thing is more on the, I don't know if technical side is the right way to put it, but it's more on the, how do you actually write a headline? Like, what are the different formulas that work for headlines? Or what about the call to action? How should you phrase that? And so on. So she has a very data-driven approach to doing that, and doing things like going through and mining reviews on Amazon for competitors' products and seeing what is the actual raw language that people are using and throw it back at their face. The example she likes to give is she was brought on to help a, psychological clinic or something like that. And they were really struggling to get their website to actually do anything, to get people to call in or to write in as a result of visiting. And it said, I don't remember the details, but it was something like best mental rehab clinic or something like that in location. I think she went on Amazon, and one of the top rated reviews for a book on mental health was something like, if you think there's a problem and get help, or something like that. I'm butchering it, but it was just basically something that an actual person who suffers from a mental health problem actually wrote on Amazon. What I like about Joanna is her thing is saying that copywriting is a curation exercise rather than a creation exercise. So it's more about curating. That's why, I'm so big on, give me what people have written in about a product or service, and let's distill that down and curate it in such a way that it tells a story and ultimately leads somebody to what we want them to do.
To also address at this moment in time, there is surely a skeptic in the audience that is saying to themselves, okay, great, Mr. Coveil, you've got this well-spoken guy on right now, and you guys are talking about persuasion. And I think I might remind that particular critic or skeptic right now that if you have not read Bob Cialdini's 2 books, this is not something that's nefarious. This is not something that's evil. This is appropriate business if done the right way.
It's the whole sales is evil kind of perspective that a lot of people have. But if you really want to get to the common core truth of everything, is that, everything's a sale. If you want to get somebody to marry you, you need to sell yourself to them. And persuasion is a big part of that. If you want to get somebody to start a business with you, same deal. If you want to get somebody to, I don't know, go on a vacation with you, same thing. So it's not like with anything. It can be, it's a set of strategies and tactics that can be used for, potentially good or bad. Persuasion by itself is not anything bad. I think the mistake that I think a lot of us make, and this is something that I struggled with myself personally, is that, we live in this meritocratic world where everything is chosen based off of, here are the facts, take it or leave it sort of thing. But the thing that actually really matters most is, how can we show somebody how the facts can actually benefit them and benefit them uniquely? Yes, I'm going to offer X, Y, and Z, but why does X, Y, and Z matter so much for you? And how can I help telegraph that to you? And how can I show you that, this is X, Y, and Z. Once you learn it or use it or whatever, that's going to bring you here. And this is why this new place it's going to bring you is so much better than where you are right now. And it doesn't need to be, I think that the mistake is that a lot of us immediately look at that structure and we think, okay, so, selling the dream, selling the sizzle, how is this any better than what the late night infomercials are doing? And it's the same. But, if the infomercial is pushing a crappy product, that's their fault. It doesn't mean that the actual method used is anything bad.
As we shift, building on this foundation, as we shift on the thread that I imagine taking us up to current day, and I set this stage at the beginning of the conversation with email and my experiences with email going back nearly 20 years. Let's talk about email for a moment. Where it is today, how you see it. Let's just talk about that for a moment, for how you see email today. My perspective, it still seems like to me that for serious people, everyone has an email. If I want to reach out to a random Nobel Prize winner that I do not know, and they happen to teach at Harvard, I can find their email address in about 2 seconds, and it still works. It's still an extremely effective way at reaching people.
Well, first thing I'd say is it's decentralized, meaning I can't WhatsApp message somebody without WhatsApp. I can't Facebook message somebody without Facebook. So it's a very nice identity platform. It's if you want to go on about the whole cryptocurrency thing, it's similar in a way to that, but it was, it's a decentralized platform that's peer-to-peer. So yeah, I'm with you in that. I don't think it's going anywhere at all. And any professional worth their salt generally lives in their inbox. And that's why I'm actually so bullish about email versus things like, the next social media strategy you can use or something like that. Because first off, I've tried both. I've done things like launching a product over Twitter and seen, okay, there's 1 or 2 sales, and then the email goes out and there's a flood of sales.
That hasn't changed for 20 years.
No, exactly. I don't think it's going anywhere because, again, it's a platform that's not owned. There are definitely limitations, I think, with it, mostly because it hasn't really evolved in decades, in the sense that it's pretty much a subject, recipients, and body copy. Granted, some like Gmail, for instance, has made it so if there's a YouTube link, it'll embed a little YouTube icon. If there's a map link, it'll embed a little map icon and different things like that. But for the most part, nothing's changed. But the thing that I like to say is, you and I are spending, say, an hour and a half or something recording this. Anything that's happening on Twitter right now, which I'm a big fan of Twitter, but anything that's happening on Twitter, I am not going to see. It's gone. Whereas any email that I get right now, I need to either archive it, read it, delete it. I need to act on it, right? Whereas anything that is happening on social media right now, it's ephemeral. It's there and then it's gone. That's why I think that, for one thing, email works exceptionally well, is because if I send you an email, you need to do something with it. Now, sure, you can let your inbox pile up and you have thousands of unreads, and in a way you could say, okay, well, sure. But let's face it, the majority of us who are professionals who work in our inbox to set up meetings or to, talk to coworkers or to, clients or whatever else, we live in our inbox. Our inbox is where work happens. So if we're communicating with somebody in their inbox, again, where work happens, that's why I think it works so well. And another thing is, when I get an automated email from, say, Amazon, and it's covered in images and it has a background color and all these different things, for the most part, people don't write to each other like that. You're never going to get an email from me to you that it has background color and some graphical headline and a bunch of pictures. It's going to be text more or less, right? So that's why when I send my emails, and I think you do the same, they look the same. They're text-based. They're not graphically covered with anything or anything like that. They're text, because text is, if I'm reading an email about, hey, do you want to grab lunch tomorrow at noon? Sure. Reply, send it off. Next email. Here's an email from from you. I'm still kind of in that mindset of this is a one-to-one communication, even though, yes, there's the unsubscribe link. It's obviously a one-to-many. This went out to thousands of other people, but psychologically, it looks the same as that other email I just handled.
And that starts to lay the foundation for the next step in our conversation, which is we are all conditioned to this email usage, this in, this out, the constant checking. And so if, from a standpoint of permission, it works best with permission, obviously, if someone comes into your inbox and you've allowed them in to present, to potentially sell, this is huge. This is huge. And it's not, I don't think it's effectively utilized by a lot of people. Now, if you want to elaborate some, because we're going to ultimately get to an endpoint with right message, I'm sure your career has evolved some in how you see the use of email inside a funnel. And I want you to define a funnel. But this notion of email as this great tool, once you get past basic communication, as a fantastic sales tool, most people are not utilizing it in a way that they should, are they?
There's a lot of people sending email, especially when it comes to sending newsletters or something like that. But no, I don't think so. And I think that the real root of it is something that I've been critical of for a while, which is the kind of the usual formula that a lot of us have, which is we have a blog, we have content that we produce. Attached to this content, we have some sort of thing that's trying to get somebody to give us an email address. So typically at the minimum, it's hey, if you like content like this and want to get future content, put in your email address and I'll send it to you.
Sounds like me.
and again, it's a very common formula. Or it's something like get this ebook that I've written, or get this free report or white paper or something like that. And then you deliver that to them. And then now they're just on your newsletter. So whenever you happen to be, writing your next magnum opus and send it out to everyone, they get it. My issue with that is I'm very interested in life cycle marketing, meaning, when you do a broadcast newsletter, everyone, it doesn't matter if they just joined your list that morning or they've been your best customer for the last year, they get that same email typically. And a lot of people do this where they don't have any sort of segmentation. They're just saying, look, here's my updates for the week, send it out, everyone gets it. But the disconnect, I think, is that, again, it goes to that whole idea of, well, what relationship do I have with this person? Are they capable of correctly digesting the contents of this email, like somebody who has been around me for the last year is able to? And that kind of thinking, where you're thinking, well, maybe it makes some sort of sense to have some sort of indoctrination or onboarding program where when somebody does get introduced to me from, they go to Google, they ask Google a question about how do I stop losing money in the stock market? And then they end up on this article that happens to be on this website called Trend Following that they've never heard of. And they read the article and they think, this is good stuff. I've gotten something out of it. I want more. The disconnect first is that when you say something like, put in your email address and I'll send you future stuff, there's two issues. One of which is people want more right then. One way to solve that is to give them something immediately versus saying, yeah, I'll send you something and I don't know when that is, but at some point in the future, I'll send you something. The other thing is people generally are going to want, if they're reading an article about, options trading or something like that, if you give them some generic ebook on portfolio selection or something, that isn't in line with what they want, right? They're probably going to want to go deeper down the rabbit hole of Mike's thoughts on options trading or something like that. And that's the thing that savvy marketers have picked up on that. And they're doing things called content upgrades, where your most popular content that Google sends traffic to, or social media or whatever sends traffic to, instead of just saying, get on my list. Instead, they're saying, hey, if you really got a lot out of this article on options trading, download this checklist that's all about everything that you need to know, cheat sheet type thing on options trading or something, right? That's very in line and direct with what they just read. Wouldn't you know, traffic that reads those articles, 10 to 20% of them end up typically opting in for that versus the 2%, if you're lucky, that opt in for your join my newsletter, pitch. So it's really about putting yourself in the shoes of who somebody is and what are they reading now? What brought them to you? What can you tell about somebody based on the content they're reading of yours right now? What makes sense to give them next? And then once you give them something, well, what makes sense to then lead them down a path that will help make them better off ultimately in a way that they're not right now?
For the audience out there that's kind of following us along and they're hearing this philosophical construct, this basis, tell people from your perspective right now, and you get brass tacks, you're a guy with a programming mindset, when an email address comes into Brennan's world, your world, tell people, we're going to explain how you do this to some degree too, but when that email address comes into your world now, you have the ability to attach a $sign to it.
Correct. Yes.
Explain that.
You asked earlier about funnels. So I guess this is where we can introduce the concept of what we mean by funnels. Okay. So somebody's on my site and they're reading about pricing theory and they're not on my list. They're fully anonymous. They just showed up from a referral or Google or something like that. So they're reading an article about how to price your next proposal or something like that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give them something that's canned, that's prepackaged, I call it Charge What You're Worth, which is a product that costs an email address to buy. It's a course that they can enroll in that is quote unquote free, but it does require creating a relationship. For my part, that's the entry point of my funnel. But when people join this course, I ask them, so what kind of work do you do? And I ask them, I give them options like I'm a programmer, I'm a designer, I'm a writer, I'm a marketer, and so on. They give me their email address and they tell me that. And then they get immediately lesson 1 of this course. I know one bit of information from them, which is the kind of work they do. So immediately out of the gate, I'm not going to address them so I target freelancers. I'm not going to address them as a freelancer. I'm going to address them as a freelance designer. And then I use worksheets that I attach and include to every lesson. So there's 9 lessons that go out. Every lesson has a little worksheet. And the goal is to get somebody to apply what they've learned to their own life, their own business. So it'll be things like, tell me a bit about how you've historically represented yourself to clients in the past. Like, how have you described yourself? And a lot of this is free form, which I can't do much with yet. But some of it is structural. So it's a drop-down list or it's a, yes or no kind of question. And over time, I'm able to develop effectively a profile about who somebody is. And as they go through this course, the future lessons shift. So if I learn that they are a designer when they opt in or join the course, I'm going to address them as a freelance designer. Now, the next lesson, if they tell me they're an agency, so they're not solo, but they work with an agency, now in the future, I'm going to describe them as a design agency. So it becomes a little more relevant, a little more personalized to them. So they go through this funnel. And again, these are lessons. There's no pitch at the end of these. It's just educational. What I'm doing is I'm setting out a 10,000 foot perspective overview of my philosophy when it comes to sales. Selling selling consulting services. So I talk about what people do wrong. I give ideas about what you should be doing instead. I introduce things like Socratic questioning as a way of learning about why your client actually wants to spend a lot of money on you. And hint, it's not because they love code or designs or whatever else. So I give them these lessons that people really like that include these worksheets that help me profile them individually. And then what happens is when they go through the course, then eventually, depending on how engaged they are, they're going to get pitched on a premium course, a paid course that is the free one, but on steroids, that includes a lot of turnkey materials, so templates and contract samples and all that other stuff. And what I do is by the time they get to that, by the time they're pitched both over email and when they click through to the sales page, the content changes depending on, I ask them point blank when they join. So why did you join? Like, what is the root problem that got you to want to join this course? Because that root problem is the same root problem that is going to help me better explain the paid product. And then I ask them, questions about how they've done things in the past. So once they've gone through the 9-lesson course, they've learned a lot. But on top of that, I've also developed a rich profile about them that I can then use to influence really everything. So I know, why did they join the free course? Well, that gives me an idea of how I can show them the benefit of joining the paid course. Or what is their next step? Maybe they want to build a system. Maybe they want to start changing the way that they write proposals. What are they planning on doing now that they've learned this free stuff? And all of that goes into building really a one-off, unique sales pitch just for them. And that's been wildly successful. And that's the breadwinner for me.
As you lay all that out, though, and you say it makes money every week, and again, this is something I hope people have their creativity caps on, because you and I could be talking about widgets. It's irrelevant. It's the process you've put together. It's not, the particular, you're involved in consulting and whatnot. I'm involved in trading. It's not really relevant. It's the process. Speak to that number, though, because I brought that up. The idea that now that you've got people in this funnel and you start to understand more about them. And look, people have got to think about this from the standpoint of like, hey, everyone that comes to Brennan's website or my website or whoever's website, Tim Ferriss's, whoever, not everyone's going to give their email address. And if they do give their email address, that doesn't mean they're going to become a client. So there's a whole process of numbers thinking here. It starts to be a lot like a casino in Steve Wynn, doesn't it?
It is. It's exactly that. But it's really easy to figure out, because on a funnel like the one I just described, like you said, people come to the website. 95 of them will not give me their email address. Say 5 of them do. Those 5 who do will go through an email course, and only say 5 or 6% of them will buy. But what that gives me at the end of the day is, well, what's the average order value of somebody who buys? For me, it's $207. And then how many people who go through this funnel and get pitched end up buying? And right now it's about 6-7%, depending on the week. That's simple math. Just divide, 207 by effect, or get what's 6% of 207, whatever that number is. I don't have it off the top of my head right now, but that is my value per subscriber who goes through this funnel. You get that number. And I think for me, so I'm going to get into segmentation in a second, but for me, the average is about $20-ish at the end of the day. Because what I take into account is not only them buying during that pitch, but then what do they end up spending throughout the next year? So there's that immediate, intentional, I'm trying to sell you X for Y. But then there's 3 months down the road, maybe then that's when they buy, but at full price, or maybe they buy something else for me. But at the end of the day, I'm able to get a value per subscriber. And then it just becomes another math exercise of saying, well, how many people need to come to the site to get a subscriber, and what percentage of them convert? And then you can get a value per visitor. And that's where things get really fun, because then you can start to say, I've got this system. I can play with the different levers, and I can say, well, what if I try to focus now this week on getting more visitors to subscribe? Well, then that immediately will boost up the value per visitor, right? If you go from 5 to 10%, that doubles, I should say, your value per website visitor. And then that changes everything when it comes to, say, paid marketing, or going out and saying, I'm going to go and do a podcast tour, or I'm going to go write guest posts, and I'm going to get these people to send me traffic. Well, if every visitor who comes over from this channel is worth $1, and I go and I write on a blog that's read by the kind of people that I want, and I get 10,000 then probably to come over, that's the value for that exercise for you, right? And that's more the immediate value. That doesn't affect the long term, 3 years down the road they buy, the referrals they might send you, and so on. That's just a very initial value that you're putting on somebody. And for me, that's the most exciting thing, because what I do is I have that funnel, but I can break it down by your segment. I ask people things like, what kind of business do you run? Well, for me, programmers are worth twice as much as the next segment, which is designers. So what does that tell me? Well, that tells me when I go to think about where am I going to focus my marketing efforts, I'm going to focus on the ones that are worth twice as much than the others, which, I'm going to go and write guest posts and do podcast tours and everything else on blogs and podcasts listened to or read by developers. So you're able to just it becomes, like you said, this giant math equation like a casino has, where they know, if we get 10,000 people in the door, the average, revenue we make per person who enters the door is X. We then compound that with the food sales and the everything else they do. And you start to see, if we can put values on these different things and we can optimize these different stages of the funnel, well, then the whole business is a giant mathematical equation that we can tweak and play with.
Yeah. And I think for those people that are listening right now that are really interested and want to kind of go down this path because they want to improve their life, it's a no-brainer. For those people that are listening because they're just curious and they listen to my podcast, maybe they're a trading person, maybe they're not, whatever. But what you just described is a trading system. It's a system. And I think the one
Right.
the one thing that you have left out so far, which is perhaps the most interesting part to me, is the automation. You've not talked about that yet, which is everything you've described so far is not Brennan sitting up in the middle of the night with a bunch of gear shifts, like in that, what was the movie with the code breakers in the UK? It's just not you with a full-size, unit where you're sitting there pressing pedals all night long. You're sleeping like a baby.
Yes. Which is nice, because it's actually very nice to know that when you do go off the grid, which I don't do much of, but when I do, everything is just working. Pragmatically speaking, what this means to me is people right now, I get about 50 to 100 people a day joining that course I mentioned. Some are joining right now while we're interviewing this or while we're doing this interview. They're getting the first lesson. Other people are getting the second lesson. Others are getting the 9th lesson. Others are getting, it's Tuesday right now, so they're getting every Monday through Thursday, I have a pitch window open up depending on how engaged you are. So every week I have a sale that's fully on autopilot. All the urgency, all the typical things that would happen during a big launch or a big sale, fully automated. That's been huge because it allows me to, a lot of people when they sell online, you see this a lot in the info marketing space. They do these big quarterly launches where they shut down everything for a week and just blast their entire list relentlessly and try to get them to buy whatever. And with this, it's more life cycle based. It's more, there's that element of, well, you're highly engaged because you just joined this email course that you wanted to learn more about this subject. And now I'm presenting a way to learn even more and to go even further with that subject once you complete that course. So it's around their own timeline versus me saying, hey, it's March 20th, time to blast the entire list with whatever I want them to buy today. I don't care if they've been around for years or if they just opted in literally 10 minutes ago, everyone's getting the same thing. So that's been a big thing. That automation element has been, it might seem like, okay, it enables me to go sit on a beach in Bali and just drink Mai Tais and let the money come in. And that could happen. This enables that, but it doesn't need to just be the easy way out. It's better for your customers. It's better for people to be given content on their timeline based on how they're behaving, based on what they need at that point, versus a top-down, I've got 50,000 people that are getting this next email. They're all going to get the same thing on my timeline and so on. That's not a very appropriate way of connecting with people at scale.
If I'm sitting back and I observe how sales and marketing takes place, I could deal with the used car guy who looks like he's dealing from the bottom of the deck and just making it up on the fly. Or if somebody says, hey, I've got this full suite of tools, technology, we all use email, and I have sat down and I have mapped out very carefully like a program, I've mapped out very carefully all the if-thens that I can possibly imagine so I can best cater to the people that want to learn from me. It's a light bulb moment. I've had that light bulb moment, but it's a light bulb moment, and everybody should strive for that, because ultimately the people that are your, they're your fans, they're your supporters, then you're giving them your best foot forward. You're showing them that you've thought through everything. And look, let's you and I both admit this. This takes work. This is not just like some, Don LaPree selling tiny little ads on an infomercial. This is serious effort. This is serious effort.
Yeah. And the good thing is, like we talked about way early in the discussion, I mean, this isn't something I've had this system up for the last 2 years. The first version was, in retrospect, crap, but it's improved over time because, like you said, I've kept my ear to the ground and I optimized early on for people to reply and to tell me, instead of filling out a worksheet, reply to this email and tell me what your next steps are. And I was able to collect raw data that I was able to normalize over time. So you get a lot of raw data and then really, I think that the thing that I think is the hardest thing to do, but the most rewarding thing, is to sift through a lot of raw data and to try to look at, I mean, this is right up your alley, but the trends. What are people saying that is common? What are the things, I call it normalizing. When normalizing a raw data set, what are the signals that keep getting sent? And then what can we do with these signals? And can we break down this raw data maybe into 3 or 4 different segments of types of people, personas? Well, how do we then automatically, instead of waiting for somebody to write back with their life story, how can we automatically bucket people based on certain signals they're sending? So if they came from, my case, if they landed on a article on my site that's about how to start a freelancing business, the fact that they came there from Google tells me everything I need to know about them. That they are not looking to scale an agency. They're not looking to become some uber premium consultant. They're looking to just start, and they need to be spoken to that way. And that's the kind of thinking that has led me down this path of, automation is better for people because it's better for me because I'm not on this hamster wheel of churning out content, but it's better for them because they're getting content based on what they need when they need it. And it's my job as really a curator of these systems to give it to them in a good way. But then there's that automation side, but then there's also the personalization side, which is saying, look, the guy who shows up on the start a business article and opts in that way is going to be much different than the person who was referred to me from scaleyouragency.com that sent me traffic to an article I wrote. These are very different types of people. I need to speak to them differently. And the big eye opener for me was, so I used to have a software company called PlanScope that I sold in 2016. It was targeting freelancers. It was project management software. And I would occasionally get agencies who would look at it because we had an agency plan. And I remember being on a call with one of these agencies and asking them, so, point blank, why haven't you signed up? And they said, I haven't signed up because you use freelancing in your marketing, and anything that works for freelancers could not work for us as an agency. And when you really look at that, I mean, it's a bit vain to say because they're both working with clients just at different scales. There's a lot of sense in that, right? There's a lot of, they're thinking, look, if this is saying stuff to a type of person that I'm not, I want the thing that's made just for me. And that's why niching works so well, because people want the thing built just for them. And so I've found a way, I think, with my setup, my system, to give people content when it makes sense to give it to them, and to position that content to deliver it in a way that fits the kind of business they run, where they are developmentally in that business, and so on.
It's going to be a little bit difficult to map this out on a conversation. People can go check you out and dig a little bit more. But as a quick side note, to talk about a tool, you use email software, software to help send out emails. I have had a chance to see how you, as an architect, design some of these if-then decision trees. So I want people listening to this conversation to realize that there does start to become some very interesting work behind the scenes with assorted tools to tackle and to solve some of the philosophical things we're talking about. This isn't just pie in the sky. This is like brass tacks, code it out, make it run, as you say, automate it. Let's shift this conversation, because you've moved into a pretty big venture for yourself now, and it builds off everything we've talked about. It incorporates. But why don't you explain how that evolution has started to happen where you have branched into this new venture that's, I'm guessing, is probably taking more of your sleep than you'd like.
For better or worse, yes. Since 2012, with the two companies, one of them I still run, the other I sold, Double Your Freelancing and PlanScope. Those businesses have always been very content focused. I would generate leads through creating free content. The very first thing that I noticed that is something that I've always been annoyed at is, and you've probably, if you're listening, you're on somebody's newsletter. You get an email from somebody and they're saying, hey, here's some new content I just posted on my site. You read the little email and you click through to the link that goes to their website. And then you're hit by a pop-up saying, what's your email address? That rubbed me the wrong way.
I think I do that too. What the hell?
I'm like, you just emailed me and now you want my email. Like, that is not only a bad user experience, that's a wasted opportunity. So the very first thing that I did way back when was I made it so that if you're on my email list and you opt into on my website, I write a little cookie. So cookie is just a little kind of metadata you can store about somebody who visits your website. And I basically just say, on my list equals true. And that was it. So then if they come back to my website, they're not being asked to give me their email address. Instead, they're being pushed towards the thing I want them to buy, namely my software product. And that was it. That for the longest time, that's all the complexity I had. And to be honest, that's more complexity than a lot of people have, but it's one of those things that people should be doing, especially nowadays that you have all these like pop-ups and slide-ups and all these things that are all kind of assaulting you when you're trying to read content. It makes sense to eliminate that if you already have that info. So I started with that. But then a big pivotal moment for me was my main course, which is called Double Your Freelancing Rate. It's had about almost 9,000 people buy it over the years. It's done well. And that's the one, that funnel I described over the last few minutes. That funnel leads to this course. Early on, the kind of people who followed me were people like me. So it was mostly web developers, programmers, some web designers, but for the most part, that was it. So that led to almost a selection bias in the case studies and testimonials I got. The language on my sales page for the product was written in a way that made sense to people like me. The testimonials were other people like me too. Yes, it worked really well. If you're a web developer, you go to the sales page, aligns perfectly with what who you are and what you need, you're likely to buy. I got an email from a copywriter who, I always remember this email. She said, hey, I've heard great things about your course. I was referred to it by a friend of mine. I'm looking over your sales page though, and it looks like it's targeting web developers and designers. Can this help me? I was able to save that sale over email by just saying, look, it's agnostic about the kind of work you do. It's a course on how to build a system for selling. If you're selling consulting, I don't care what you're selling is immaterial to me. The principles behind it are identical. That stuck out with me. And I knew that if I got an email like that, how many other people thought that same thing, but closed the tab or clicked the back button? That led me down the path of saying, well, I'm a programmer. I can figure this stuff out. What if I just ask somebody when they go to join my list what kind of work they do? And then if they ever make it to the sales page, if I see they're a copywriter, why don't I just talk about copywriting? Why don't I show testimonials from other copywriters? Like, really simple. And it's a very, dare I say, common sense assumption to make that people want to see language and success stories from other people like them. That's all I did. And then I noticed an immediate lift in sales. And then that got me down this rabbit hole of thinking, well, what else could I do? What if I take into account the size of their business or what their goals are with the business? And how can I collect this data? Maybe I give them a little survey. If I give them a survey and they tell me that they're looking to, this is their goal with consulting is to do X, maybe to build a product. I remember that. I store it with that contact record I have in my email marketing app or CRM. I remember that. And then I just say, like, if their goal is product, say this headline. Otherwise, if it's to build an agency, say that headline. Otherwise, say this headline. And that's kind of the next iteration. And it worked really well. And then I started getting, I want to say real companies. I remember I got a call from a small business factoring company. So think cabbage, but not cabbage, who gives lines of credits to businesses based on cash flow and invoices. They called me and said, well, what if you did this, but for an actual business, not a company, not your little homegrown business where you're peddling online courses. What if you did this for a real business, right? So that led me down up to Manhattan to meet with them and to work with them on this. But that's the kind of thing that made me think, this is working really well for me. And there's a lot of truth to what they're saying. And like, what if you applied this way of thinking where, Amazon's doing it? All these big online retailers that have a lot of developers on staff are doing this, but the majority of most websites are effectively static.
How does the person like me, who's been at this for a long time, and the person like me could be just basically everybody that's not Bezos, how do we start to develop that personalization in a way that doesn't cause us to just work? I mean, look, I have no problem with hard work, but, I think we can all start to think, my gosh, this gets time consuming. I mean, it's the tool that gets us there without breaking our brain in half.
Right. And that was so when people would ask me about, so how do you do this on your website? I would get all technical, unfortunately, and talk about all the code I've written to enable that. And you'd see their eyes kind of gloss over and they'd be like, okay, well, off to that other marketing tactic I was reading up on. That made me think, well, what if we, all I'm really doing is I'm saying, if this is true, do this. So it's a lot like, if this, then that. The website that says, if you enter your house, turn on your light bulbs. Well, what if we did the same but on your website? And what if we made it so, all these people are using pretty much the same tool set, the same email marketing apps or CRMs. So companies like Drip or ConvertKit or MailChimp or Infusionsoft or whoever. Well, what if we just integrate with them? Like I've had to do that manually for the tool I use, but what if we just integrated with all the big ones? And we could let you query and say, if they are a customer, do this. If they have this tag, do that. If they visited this page, the pricing page, let's say, show this. That's that one side. But the what do we do with that? That's the thing that we spend a lot of time and energy focusing on, which is, well, I can't expect the average, online store to be able to say, oh yeah, we'll just go write some JavaScript code to make it so we can do that. So we built this whole thing that lets people literally click on a headline and say, change it to this text and tie that change to if they have this, if they're a customer, show this text, otherwise show that text, and made it all point and click visual. And that's kind of what got us down this road.
Down this road, the right message mode.
Right Message is the company that we started. That is really just the culmination of a lot of grunt work and crappy code I've been writing for the last 6 years.
Not so crappy. I know it's a little self-deprecating.
Well, crappy, I mean, what I mean is that literally thrown together stuff that had, I like to, in a way, brag, saying, look, here's 10 lines of code that took me probably 15 minutes to write. This thing has permanently increased sales by X% for the last 5 years.
Pause for a second there, though, because I know you're, again, self-deprecation here, but it might be 10 lines of code. But back to the beginning of this conversation, it's thinking through the life cycle of the client, thinking through how the business works. And then once you think that through and you've done all the interior grunt work, the interior psychological work on who you are and what you want to represent to clients, et cetera, then it's not really a guessing game. It's kind of like, oh, I know what I am. I know what I need to execute. Boom, let's go.
You're right. And that it's kind of like the whole, I don't know if you've ever heard that story, I think it was like an IBM consultant or something who charged 10 grand or something to literally come in and flick the right switch. But it's knowing which, writing 10 lines of code is not a big deal, but you're right. It was that kind of, the backstory that led me to know what 10 lines of code to write. that's the thing that I think is.
Well, and that's why I wanted to start this conversation like we did, because there is an evolution here. There's a foundation that starts and it kind of just keeps growing. And even though I've not gone down your exact path, I can relate to it because I've lived it every step of the way, even though I wasn't coding my own solutions as you have been. I really feel like I've lived so much of this just internally that I just connect to it.
My background before getting into software and kind of courses and everything else was consulting and consulting exclusively. I built up this agency and I realized that I didn't consciously realize. I had to realize this in reflection, but if I'm speaking with somebody who was referred by X and X is somebody in that industry, and I know that this person I'm speaking to is also in that industry, well, you better believe when I go to try to sell somebody on the advantages of working with us, I'm using examples from that industry. I'm speaking to them based on, are they technically proficient, or are they more of a, MBA who wants to start this new business type thing? I'm going to change what I do. And likewise, I go to a lot of conferences. They have these after parties where you're asked, so what do you do? Depending on, so I was at, not exactly near you, but your neck of the woods, let's say in Bangkok a few months ago, where I was at a conference for digital nomads. And when I'm asked there, what do? I'm describing my business much different than if I was at a more corporate conference in Boston, or if I was asked by my neighbor, hey, Brennan, at a barbecue, so what do you do for a living? The business I do doesn't change, but the way that it's positioned, the way it's described changes.
If you don't do that, they won't understand what you do.
Exactly. And all of us do this. Everyone does it. It's just we haven't thought, look, the job, what is the role of a website typically? It's typically to get somebody to buy something, whether it's directly or through becoming a lead or something like that. It's effectively a salesperson, right? I mean, it's you hard coding a monologue into place. So your website is a monologue that you've pre-written that is there. Well, what if we could just say, look, if I was to describe this product, to this set of people versus that set of people, what would I change? How would I describe it differently? And it's thinking through that and saying, okay, well, if we get people from that, type who are visiting, let's just, what can we tweak? What can we make it so they think, look, this is a little more relevant to me. This is what I need. Because my hypothesis stems back from I don't know if you ever read the book, Don't Make Me Think. I forgot who wrote it. The idea, it's basically a book on usability. It's a book on design, if you will. And their whole thing is, look, if somebody comes to your website and you're a designer, don't go down this artistic rabbit hole of trying to say, oh, I need it to be, whatever. Just make it simple, because no one has the patience to figure out your way of doing things. No one wants to sit and think, how does this actually help and serve me? So the more we can be direct in saying, your X, here's exactly how it helps people with X. That's what people want. Leads to a better user experience, and it leads to more results for us, right, as business owners. And that's the thing that I think, people can say, well, it's kind of, I don't know if you've ever seen Black Mirror on Netflix, but, it's kind of Black Mirror-y in that you're doing all this, you're surveying people and you're looking at what they're doing and you're looking at kind of what they're telling you, and then you're doing things with that data. It's like, yeah, is that a bad thing? And I think that's a discussion that needs to be had.
You're bringing up the big issue, which is, we talked about this a little bit, which is you and I just chit-chatting, which is the dystopian thing in the future where everything is tracked, the Orwellian whatever. And look, ultimately, that's going to come down to individual choices. What kind of human being do you want to be? How do you want to use these tools? How do you want to use this knowledge? How do you want to use these processes? Now, anybody out, I would say this as a kind of as a disclaimer, but anybody out there that's thinking they don't have to go down the path that you're talking about, well, those are the same people that thought they didn't need a freaking email address. I mean, right, it's going this way, right? I mean, Bezos is worth 125 billion or whatever it is, because every time I log into Amazon, it tells me that I want all these things that I can't describe to my mother that I don't remember buying. But I mean, it's true. But let's talk about, though, the people that are worried about this. Because look, some of the headlines in the last week, People are talking about data that was lifted from Facebook to be used for political purposes. I just mentioned Bezos, who's making a bloody fortune selling people what they want. How do you look at this? Because this is going to get more granular and more granular, and it's going to look when they combine audio and video. I mean, it's pretty crazy how one can really just sit back in a few seconds and imagine where this is all headed.
Whew, this is a rabbit hole we could go down, but I think there's a lot of, let's just say it'll be interesting to see presidential races a decade or two from now. If we think this is, wait till they start digging up everything. I mean, Trump doesn't take selfies, right? Or didn't take selfies of himself at parties in Vegas or whatever and all that stuff. But the generation that will be in his shoes, a decade or two from now is. So there's a lot of, ultimately I think it boils down to what you put in the system is what they can use against you. So if you're, you can be a fairly private person and not be doing all this sort of stuff and you're only going to have a limited profile. But there's the other thing, which is in my mind the more, there's explicit segmentation, like you going into Facebook and saying you like X interest or you are Y or, whatever else. That's kind of explicit segmentation. And I mean, Facebook advertisers do this all the time. I mean, there's a lot of things you could do where I could run an ad on Facebook right now saying, target married people of this income bracket in this location. And they can do that because the way the things you check into, the restaurants you go to, send a signal about your income. Or if you're always posting yourself at airports going around the world, I mean, that signifies something about you. You're a traveler. And there's a lot of behavioral things that still require you generally to say, I'm at this location or whatever else. But, there's also the fact that our phones, know we're at this shop without us telling them we're at this shop. And they remember that, and that kind of furthers our profiles. Yeah, I mean, I don't really know. I mean, it's like with anything, it's good or bad. I mean, I prefer seeing ads personally that are more appropriate to me. I've actually bought ads that I've seen shown to me on Facebook that are, in my mind, really niche things that would not have mass appeal, but they appeal to me based off what Facebook knew about me. But I mean, you're right. I mean, the whole what is it, Cambridge Analytics issue going on right now. Brennan and crew basically just did what we're talking about here and saying, well, how can we make, the Trump candidacy more appealing based off of this factor about it?
And I'm sure the other side did it too. Everyone was in the middle of this kind of stuff. I think it's one of those things where everyone has to take a step back and say, okay, this is the direction we're going. We're going down this personalization path. Then you just have to figure out, and there's no rule book for this, you have to figure out individually, what do you want? Like, how do you want to move through this life? These tools are all out there. They're all looking at you. They're all checking you out. But what do you want? How much do you want to give away? Those are going to be some interesting choices for everyone.
Yeah, but I think the big thing is going to be that behavioral aspect, right? Unless you stop, say, visiting certain websites or stop doing this or stop doing that, you're not self-segmenting yourself.
I delete my cookies 600 times a day.
Okay, so yeah.
There's a guy looking at me on the phone right now who's waving his finger saying, we've got you.
Exactly. So, I mean, again, I think it's one of these things that, generally speaking, the trend has been since the beginning of time, before there was kind of mass advertising, everything was generally done more personally. So if you were buying tools for your tool shed and a tool shed vendor or a tool vendor came to your front door, if he'd sold to you in the past, sold you that shovel, he's going to bring up that shovel and ask how it's doing. Or, I mean, that's probably a crap example, but something like that, right? Like there's a relationship already there. There would be a highly personalized sales cycle that would get you to buy more tools. But then, we switched to the early 20th century. We have mass advertising, and you would have ads run in magazines, which in a way, or TV, which in a way are sort of niched in that, an ad that's run on Bloomberg is going to be different than an ad that's run on Nickelodeon. Ultimately, it's still sort of kind of has that broad mass appeal, but we're getting to the point now where we get all the benefits of kind of that highly personalized, how is this relevant to you form of sales that has always been with us, but we're able to do that again but at scale without needing the individual inputs of a sales team working one-on-one with a person. That's the big difference. Is the outcome, I think, is the same, which is how does this help me individually that you get when working with a salesperson or a good one. But we're able to do that now programmatically rather than using up an individual and a certain set of time, for them.
Before I direct the audience to go check you out, and you're pretty easy to check out, there's a lot of content. People can dig deep. If someone listens to you talk and they're not curious enough to go dig more, if they're not really familiar with your world, not familiar with your work and what you've figured out, I'd really start to wonder what's wrong with them. And that's not like some ass kiss, but it's like if somebody's figured something out that's interesting, that's kind of a nice new imaginative take, clever, and they don't want to dig in, I kind of really wonder about them. But before I direct people on that, I would love to ask you, since you mentioned it at the beginning, you've rattled off a few books already. The floor is yours to rattle off as many books as you'd like. I think people would really enjoy that, to think about some of the near and dear titles to you that you really think that anyone who's involved in commerce, and generally this should be people with a pulse, right? If I say anyone who's involved in commerce, this should be everybody. Are there some titles that you really think that on top of what we've talked about, that you think people should check out?
Disclaimer, I don't read many business books.
I want you to give me whatever you want to give me. I'm in your mind. I'm in there digging, man. I've got the spade out and I'm pulling for brain tissue.
I mean, I would encourage you, not like if most people I think have heard of Plato or Socrates or whatever, but I would encourage you reading one of the dialogues. If you start with one, I do the Republic. Disclaimer, I don't actually agree with him philosophically. I'm not a big fan of Socrates. He's a bit too metaphysical for me. I like the groundedness of Aristotle a bit better. But I think Socrates reads a lot better, or Plato reads a lot better when it comes to the dialogues. And they're really interesting, just the back and forth. You really look at how does Socrates get somebody from here to there conversationally? And that is something that every politician used to read these guys. That taught them how to effectively debate, how to think correctly, how to reason correctly. And I would encourage you, if you haven't, go back in time, read this stuff. It is worth it. Okay, so that's one. I'm also a big fan of Tacitus. He was a Roman historian. He was very quick and to the point. His content was, he said everything that had to be said, and he said it very quickly. I think that's a good, his stuff is good. So the Annals of Imperial Rome is a good thing. To go a little forward in time, I like David Hume, which was a Scottish philosopher from, I think, the 17th century. I think his stuff because he was kind of a contemporary, I think, of Adam Smith, who's the great economist, right? I don't know historically enough to tell whether they were actual contemporaries. I think they were both in Edinburgh, but his stuff's good. But then to jump up a little more modern, a few things that I would recommend would be Sean D'Souza has a book called The Brain Audit, which is about what he calls the 8 bags that need to be delivered to somebody or given to somebody before they're going to be ready to buy from you. I talked about Amy Hoy's Pain Dream Fix at the beginning. He kind of expands on that and gets into things like social proof and objections that you need to overcome. So if you're looking at, say, writing a sales page, which I think is something that should be capable of doing, even if it's a sales email or a sales webpage or a sales conversation, this book, The Brain Audit, is good for that. There's also Selling the Invisible. I forgot the author, but that's basically about how do you sell something that isn't tangibly in front of somebody? And I think it's by the guy who worked at, or was at Salesforce, I want to say. And one book that I read recently that I actually really enjoyed, it was more of a biography, was Shoe Dog by the founder of Nike. And that was a good book too. Just about, I didn't know anything about Nike, the company, and their backstory was pretty interesting. You've given people a homework assignment. Brennan, beyond the easy searches, people can find you. WriteMessage.com, you're on Twitter. Is there anywhere else that I'm missing? I would say WriteMessage.com. If you want to see the funnel I described earlier in practice, you can go to freepricingcourse.com, which just redirects you to a landing page for that funnel. So if you want to see how I'm looking at profile data and showing you a customized sales page, that's a fun if you want to kind of reverse engineer what I've done there. And shoot me an email. I'm Brennan at writemessage.com, Brennan. pretty open, especially if you like talking about this kind of stuff.
Brennan, it's always good to chat. We've been having this nearly year-long conversation, so I appreciate you coming on the show finally.
Yeah, thank you, Mike.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.